Dr. Chomsky, thank you very much for agreeing to participate in our symposium entitled Public Engagement and the Politics of Evidence in an Age of Neoliberalism and Audit Culture. It's often said about people that they need no introduction, but with you, I think you're a scholar that there's no question that that's the case. So welcome, Dr. Chomsky. It's been closing in on nearly 50 years since you famously wrote about the responsibility of intellectuals in the New York Review of Books. I'm wondering, has your view changed on the importance to society for the public intellectual and the publicly engaged scholar?
Actually, I did write an update for the Boston Review a couple of years ago. Basically, it's the same, and the same has been true for many years. If you ask about the phrase responsibility of intellectuals, it actually has two meanings. There's one responsibility which is based on ethical and moral principles. There's another kind of responsibility that is demanded by authoritarian structures, state power, corporate power, and so on. That's two different kinds of responsibility and two different roles of intellectuals. That has been true through history. We understand that very well, very clearly in the case of enemies. So, for example, in the case of, say, Iran, Russia, China, we have only contempt for the intellectuals who follow the responsibility of serving state policy and defending state doctrine. We dismiss them with contempt. That's the overwhelming majority. We honor and respect those who carry out critical analysis of state and crimes, often at great danger to themselves. When we turn to ourselves, we reverse the values completely. We honor and respect those who support and serve the general prevailing doctrinal systems reflecting state and corporate powers, and we condemn and dismiss the critics who raise questions about the exercise of power and condemn its crimes and excesses. In fact, it's kind of interesting that the honorary word dissident is restricted to dissidents in enemy societies. We don't call critics in the United States dissidents. I mean, I may, but it's not generally done. Those who we massacre in our dependencies, like the Jesuit intellectuals who were murdered in El Salvador by the U.S. trained and armed forces, we don't call them dissidents. They're not even, if they're mentioned at all, they're some kind of Marxists or something like that. So here the values are reversed. And that's typical. You go all through history, with very rare exceptions, back to classical Greece and the Bible. The term intellectual wasn't used, but those who we would call intellectuals today, most of them served power, flatterers at the court, and so on. There were some who criticized the crimes of the kings who corrupted the youth of Athens by asking hard questions. They may be honored today, but at the time they were condemned, killed, driven into the desert, and so on. It's a pattern that goes through right to the present. Actually, the term intellectual in its modern sense came into Western usage in connection with the Dreyfus trials in France. And today, we honor the Dreyfus arts, those who opposed state crimes and state power. It was not true at the time. They were very harshly condemned, and Zola had to flee the country. The great intellectuals, the immortals of the Académie Française, denounced these writers, playwrights. What right do they have to criticize our august institutions, the state, the army, and so on? Very similar to what we see today. That's a regular pattern. And there are two concepts of responsibility And if you look through history, they're dealt with in a fairly uniform way. There are some exceptions, but not many.
Turning that critical gaze towards higher education, I wonder, over your career, have you noticed changes in how scholarship is measured and valued within the academy? I think of audit cultures and impact factors and journal rankings and that sort of thing.
I think there are technical changes like that, but I think there are more important changes, frankly. I can see it very clearly at the institution where I work, but it's all over. This happens to be a science-based university, and if you look over the years, since I've been here 60 years, through this period, there has been changes reflecting political changes in the country. So in the pre-neoliberal period, the great growth period of the 50s and 60s, the MIT was mostly funded by the Pentagon. I was actually working in a laboratory that was 100% Pentagon funded, and most of the academic program was Pentagon. It was quite open, free, worked on what you wanted, no classified work on campus, and so on. Over the years, Pentagon funding has declined. The reason for Pentagon funding, incidentally, had nothing to do with the military, little to do with the military. It's that the government, the United States has a kind of an industrial policy. It's hidden because we're not supposed to have that. We're supposed to be a market society. But the reality is that a substantial part of the advanced economy is developed within the dynamic state sector at public expense, like what we're now using, computers, internet, and so on, developed for decades, mostly at public expense. Later, it's handed over to private power for profit making. That continued. Over the years, Pentagon funding has declined. Funding has shifted towards the biology-based institutes of the government and towards corporate funding. And corporate funding has an effect, much bigger effect on measuring scholarly work than the kinds of technical measures that you're talking about. Corporate funding, for example, tends to be short-term, applied. A corporation is not interested in producing something that will be useful for the public in 20 years. They want something that's useful for them, not their competitors tomorrow. And it also introduces a measure of secrecy. They can't impose it formally, but it can make it clear that renewed funding requires secrecy. The effect on the institute is very notable. There are departments, those that are more immediately involved in applied research, let's say the computer science department. It's changed the culture a lot. And in general, you can expect that this is part of the whole. It's one aspect of the general neoliberal assault on the public and the universities in particular, which attempts to drive the higher education system towards service to the private sector. And sometimes this takes extreme forms. As you may have noticed in the state of Wisconsin a couple of months ago, the governor, Scott Walker, and the reactionaries that he leads are attempting to undermine what was once a great public university, University of Wisconsin. And one of the measures is to try to turn it towards producing an output that they think in market terms, students who will serve the needs of the business community of Wisconsin. And one of the efforts of this actually was so outrageous it hit the newspapers. They wanted to change the mission of the university, traditional mission, which included the mission of seeking truth. They wanted to cut that out because who needs that kind of thing, and turn it directly to producing people who will be good for the workforce for Wisconsin businesses. Well, that was so outrageous, they had to claim it was a clerical error and withdraw it and so on. But it's illustrative of things that are happening not only in the United States, but throughout the world. So, for example, in England, a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago, an article there were several articles in the London Review of Books, major journal, intellectual journal, by Stefan Collini, a critical analyst of the university system, in which he concluded correctly by saying that the Cameron government, the Tory government, is attempting to turn first-class universities into third-class commercial institutions. So the classics department at Oxford will have to prove that it can sell itself on the market if people want to study classical philology, let's say. That's the ultimate vulgarization that results for imposing the state capitalist principles of the business classes on the whole society. It's happening in much harsher ways than in the university, as you can see in Greece and elsewhere. But in the university system, it's very destructive.
Do you see a change in the manner in which professors are engaging with the public? Are we less engaged? Are we less taking up the responsibility as a public intellectual as a result of the neoliberalism and the way in which we're ranked and ordered and valued or not?
There are effects. One effect is simply the decline of the autonomy of the faculty. In fact, there's a good book by an good American sociologist, Benjamin Ginsberg, called The Fall of the Faculty, in which he discusses the changes during the neoliberal period within the university systems as the role and, in fact, number of administrators has risen sharply through massive levels of bureaucratization, deans, sub-deans, assistants to sub-deans, a massive bureaucratic system, very inefficient, but that's typical of the way the corporate system works. And it's a system of kind of control and management. And the faculty role has declined accordingly. Furthermore, the neoliberal system, remember, is an attempt to impose business models. Business models, you're worried about the bottom line. So you want to get the cheap, they want what economists call flexibility of labor. That's a euphemism for beating working people over the head. So you want to beat working people over the head. The way it's done in the universities is by cutting back on the possibilities of getting a secure position within the university in which you can function effectively as a teacher and researcher. So cut back on tenure appointments, turn to temporary employments. They're much more easily controlled. They don't have rights, don't have to pay them. That means adjuncts, graduate students, let them do the work, the teaching, and meet the students, and cut back on the possibilities of doing authentic research and serious teaching, which is kind of like a waste of time. What good does that do for business? So the corporate, one of the aspects of the corporate model is simply reducing the role of faculty in a university, in running the university. I mean, it used to be in many better universities, the faculty basically ran it. That's sharply declined. One of the effects of that is there are more restrictions on faculty. So, for example, junior faculty who are basically adjuncts, temporaries, not on an academic ladder. Sure, it's going to be much harder for them to act as public intellectuals. They have no security, no opportunity. That's part of the point. Restrict the possibilities of acting freely and independently, which does involve security. And that has an effect. But overall, I think the general pattern through history remains overwhelmingly intellectuals, including academic intellectuals, want to work within the system, gain the benefits that come from obedience and passivity, not rock the boat. And not take the role of what we call dissidents in other societies. We're not allowed to use that term for ourselves.
What are some of the other greatest threats or challenges to the academy and higher learning as you see them?
Well, I think the one major problem which should not exist is the sharp rise in tuition, very significant rise in tuition. That's associated with a significant cutback in public support for the university system. So, for example, in the state system, the contribution of the states to the university system, the college and university system, has significantly declined overall. All of this, again, is part of the general imposition of business models on institutions of higher education and indeed others, which is very detrimental, of course, part of the general neoliberal program. Neoliberalism should be understood as class war. It's a form of class war which, as we can see by experience and is obvious by the design, tends to assign power and authority to narrow sectors of concentrated capital in the political leadership that's very closely linked to them, in fact, which by now they virtually buy. And that shows up in all institutions, including university. It includes the deterioration of services. And so, for example, what economists call economic efficiency is in reality economic inefficiency, in which costs are transferred to people, which economists don't measure. So to take a simple example, let's say if you call your bank, let's say, because there was an error in your the report of your last account that they sent, and you want to correct the error, what happens? You call the number, you get a recorded message. It gives you a menu, which has nothing to do with what you're interested in. You push a couple of buttons, you finally get something, that another recorded message comes along, and then you get something that says, thank you for your business, we love you, and some music plays, goes on for half an hour. Finally, if you hang on long enough, you may get a human being, and you can say what you want, and they'll send you in some wrong direction, and so on. From an economic point of view, that's highly efficient. It's reducing the cost to the bank. If they simply had a person answering the phone who could fix what you wanted in 30 seconds, that would be costly for the bank, so it's inefficient. Here, it's very costly, but it's transferred to you, and costs to individuals just aren't counted. Same with public transportation, hospitals, everything else. Those are ideological decisions within the economics profession, closely linked to business needs, of course, and it happens all over. The same is true with the bureaucratization of the universities. So instead of, say, the faculty meeting saying, let's fix this, you go through a dean, a provost, an assistant provost, a committee, finally maybe you can get somebody to listen to what you're talking about. This is, the lack of security, the use of temporary labor, very efficient from an economic point of view by ideological measures of economic efficiency. That means that many of the people actually doing the teaching and research can't even participate. They're not part of the system. They're temporary workers who can be thrown out at any time and have no role. All of these are, along with this comes the disciplinary technique of imposing high tuitions. That's mainly disciplinary. There's no economic basis for that. So take a look at other countries, say next door, Mexico, poor country, has a very, very good higher education system. I mean, they don't pay the faculty anything because it's a poor country. But the UNAM, higher universities, are quite good. It's free. Go to the most successful economy in the world, Germany, rich country. It's free. Finland, gets the highest standards by most measures, repeatedly. It's free. Go to the United States. During the period of great growth and development, 50s and 60s, education was mostly free. For the GI Bill gave free education to a vast number of people who never would have gone to college. It was very good for them. It was very good for the country. Even private colleges, the costs were so low that it was, by today's standards, almost free. Like I went to a private University of Pennsylvania. When I went, it was $100 a year, and you could get a scholarship very easily. So a working student like me could get by with paying nothing. It's an Ivy League university, and all of that is radically different today, and it imposes tremendous burdens on students. It means that they're essentially trapped for life. The way it's set up, a student can't even declare bankruptcy. So they'll take your Social Security, you're essentially trapped for life. It's a very good disciplinary technique. I suppose it's related to the bureaucratization of the universities. Lots of things you have to pay for, high salary and so on, but not for faculty, for administrators. And some of them are kind of outrageous, in fact. And that's the same is true in hospitals and in other institutions. The universities are a special case. All of those are serious problems, all linked. The university system is being undermined worldwide, much of the world, by imposition of business models, corporatization, which are highly inefficient, designed for control and management, and undermining independence, freedom, creativity, which makes perfect sense from a business point of view. You don't want your workers to be free and independent. You want them to do what they're told.
If this interview was part of a collective call to action, as it is, what actions would you suggest would be the most effective?
Well, for example, there are important moves taking place to unionize adjuncts and graduate students, to give them the kind of support that comes from solidarity and acting together, especially if faculty will join in supporting them. The moves towards, at some level, these are governmental decisions. So let's say the defunding of state colleges, that's a matter of action at the legislative level. That means trying to reverse policies which are very harmful and indeed opposed by most of the population. We have to bear in mind that in our current sharp deterioration of democracy, the public attitudes don't really matter very much. So, for example, let's say, take taxes. For decades, there have been regular polls on what people think about taxes. There's some good studies about this in the political science literature. Turns out overwhelmingly, people want higher taxes on the rich. That's almost never reported. What gets reported from the same polls, a poll will say, do you think you pay too much taxes? Yeah, everybody says, yeah. So, do you want higher taxes on the rich? Sure, we should have higher taxes on the rich. What gets reported is people are opposed to taxes, not let's have higher taxes on the rich, literally. And that gives the impression to people who read the polls, well, I must be kind of a weirdo. Everybody else just wants taxes reduced. They don't. That's even true of people who call themselves get the government off my back and so on. And that goes across the board. And so, for example, take the health system. Huge drain on the economy. I mean, we have the health system is an international scandal. It's about twice the costs per capita of comparable countries, some of the relatively poor outcomes. For decades, a large part of the population, often a considerable majority, wanted national health care. In the late 80s, for example, end of the Reagan years, about 70% of the public thought that there should be a constitutional guarantee for public health care. And in fact, 40% of the population thought there already was one. It was such an obvious desiderata. It never became policy. When the Obama program was instituted, there was discussion of at least a public option. At least one of the options should be, do you want something like Medicare? A considerable majority of the population favored that, but it wasn't even considered. I mean, business control of the political system and the undermining of democracy is so extreme that what the public wants just isn't considered. And the result is the Obama program is an improvement, better than the awful system that there was, but very complex, very costly. Again, many of the costs are transferred to individuals. If you've taken the trouble of trying to register in the system, you'll find out quickly how the costs are transferred to you. It's a very complex problem. It's not a matter of, like in most countries, if you're sick, you go to the hospital and they take care of you, period. So this system, it's happening in the health system, huge cost to the economy. The infrastructure system is ludicrous. The U.S. is, for example, the U.S. is one of the few countries, very few, in which you can't take a high-speed train. I mean, you can take a high-speed rail from China to Kazakhstan, but you can't from New York to Boston. In fact, the fastest train now, when it runs, doesn't have an accident, today is not much faster than when I took it about 60 years ago, 70 years ago. All of this is understandable consequences of business domination of the economy. And it shows up in very destructive ways. They rarely get reported, but just to give an illustration, very recently, maybe a couple of weeks ago, the International Monetary Fund published a study, a very important study, of public subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. Now, it is not a secret to people who don't live under a rock that unless we leave most of the fossil fuels in the ground, we're essentially doomed. How do governments react to this? According to the IMF, by providing over $5 trillion a year in public subsidies to the industries that are dedicated to destroying human existence. You'd think that might make it to a newspaper somewhere. Well, you can check and find out. But all of these things are linked. Universities are one case. Sorry, but we're
Well, thank you so much for your participation in our symposium and for your sage advice and for your lifetime of work. It's been a real pleasure.
Good stuff.